Well, hi everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. We appreciate your time in joining. My name is Rochelle Gruber, and I'm with Caveon Test Security, and I'm just introducing the session today and want to welcome you all, and thanks for your time. We do have a couple upcoming Caveon events that we just wanted to let you know about as we're waiting for a couple more people to join in. Every month we have a Caveon webinar series where you can attend sessions on various testing topics. We do those almost every month of the year, and they're free. They're about an hour long, kind of like this one, and it's just a really good place to gain information about current topics in testing, test security, test development, all things testing. So I've included a link in this webinar, on this slide, to our past webinars, and also where you can find information about upcoming sessions and register for them. The Certified Exam Security Professional, I'm not sure how many of you have heard about this new certification, but it's the first ever certification for test security professionals. It's basically a self-study course that's been put together through a cooperative agreement. Caveon has been instrumental in helping with that, also the Institute for Exam Security, which is a new nonprofit organization. The test is now available. It is an online study course. You basically kind of pace yourself, go through tons of helpful resource materials, and then when you feel ready, you can go ahead and take the exam. So cespcert.org is the website. You may want to check that out if that's something that sounds interesting to you. Finally, Caveon now offers test security training workshops in your home city. We will actually come out and do a 2-day workshop, very comprehensive overview of test security processes, best practices, things like that, and we can tailor it to your needs. So if your state is more advanced in that area, we can increase the curriculum level a little bit, or if you're kind of just starting out, we can do that as well. So let us know if that's something that interests you. Next slide, please. Okay, great. Thanks, Tristan. So just a few ways to connect with us if you're unaware. We do a blog every week and post that on our website, so that's always a good place where we're to find information on hot topics and testing, also some kind of fun takes on different issues that are out there. You can follow us on Twitter at Caveon, and at Test Security Guy is Dr. Fremer's Twitter handle there, so he's kind of a fun one to follow as well. We also have different pages on LinkedIn, the Test Security Group as well, and we're on Facebook. Next slide, please. Our connection's a little bit slow today. We have some windy weather in Salt Lake, which is where Tristan and I are, so it's taking a little bit longer, so apologize for that delay. So housekeeping today, just a couple things. Everyone is on mute during this session. For those of you with Sonia, she will be able to unmute during the discussion periods and allow you to speak. For those of you who are not with her and you are off site, I can attempt to unmute you. Sometimes that doesn't work if you did not put in your audio pin. So if I'm unable to unmute you, go ahead and enter anything you'd like to say into the question box, and I'll relay that information during this session. Also, if you have something that comes up and you don't want to interrupt, go ahead and type it into the question box as well, and I'll be happy to ask that at a stopping point. So without further ado, we can go ahead and get started. Lessons learned in improving test security for states, and I'm very pleased to introduce my two colleagues. We call them the Johns at Caveon. John Fremer is a founder of Caveon Test Security, and we are a company that helps test programs, test sponsors, test agencies, states, school districts, and others improve security practices in all phases of test development, administration, reporting, and score use. Dr. Fremer has 50+ years of experience in the field, and also we have today Dr. John Olson. Since 2008, Dr. Olson has been serving as a senior security consultant for Caveon, and he provides assistance with a variety of test security activities, including test security audits and investigations, site visits, interviews, reports, research, all types of things. Dr. Olson is also the president of the consulting business that he founded in 2006, which is Olson Educational Measurement and Assessment Services. And back in 2012, 2013, they're together through an effort sponsored by CCSSO and created the TILSA Test Security Guidebook. And that, if you don't have that publication, it's available for free. You can download it for free on the CCSSO website. It's also linked on the Caveon site if you'd like to find it there. It's a great resource. So now, fast forward a couple years, based on the TILSA Guidebook, the same group kind of came together, did some more research, and found out what states have done since then, and kind of where we're at today. So that's what they'll be discussing today, the follow-up publication. We also have that available for you if you'd like a copy. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Fremer to kick us off.
Okay, next slide, please. Welcome to the folks in Oklahoma. This slide is to explain why we've chosen to do these webinars for states. Both John Olson and I are very proud of these two projects that Rochelle summarized, and we think they have good information that state people could use. But state staff seem to be busier every year, more demands and not necessarily more people. So getting their attention and saying, well, you ought to read something, didn't seem to us to be working, and yet the state folks who had looked at these reports said that, gee, there's a lot of good stuff in here. And a group that knows them very well is the group that attends CCSSO's technical issues and large-scale assessment. They really know these reports. They work with us on doing them. But other states may very likely have had little time to look at them. So we thought if we went over with the states who are interested what's in there, they then may be able to take advantage of what's there and follow up on things that are of particular interest to them. So let me hand it over to the other John in the group, John Olson.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be able to do this for Oklahoma, Sonia and the team. So I'm looking forward to interacting with you. We're dividing our presentations up, John and myself, into two parts. I'm going to give an overview of the TILSA project, the focus on test security, and some of the contents of the reports that we did, and then John will finish up by giving you details of recommendations in some key areas for states to improve their test security. So, as you know, I'm not sure when Oklahoma was, or if Oklahoma was ever in the TILSA project. It's been around a long time. I was actually involved in it back in 1995 for some work I was doing related to NAEP. Anyway, it tackles a lot of different key topics, and test security became a big topic. So a work group was formed, and a lot of sharing of information, of which John and I participated very heavily in this work group and created these documents that we'll be talking about. And the key thing was states were starting to feel a little pressured, and did they have really good procedures for prevention and detection of testing irregularities. And certainly, the whole thing in Atlanta was starting to scare people. So, so we'll talk about that. Next slide. Also, like I was saying, we'll summarize some of the key points of these two reports, and they're listed here on this slide. The guidebook, it's our shorthand, and then the subsequent one, the lessons learned, and that will be more of our main focus. Since it just came out in June of this year, we also show you the links where you can download these reports from the CCSSO website. By the way, we will send you this PowerPoint too after our webinar today, so you'll have that for your staff. All right, so next slide. Here's what I would like to present to you then. A little more background and context on our test security project. It went on for about 4 years, so there's a lot of things that we learned. How John and I, and working closely with states collaboratively, decided to what would go into the lessons learned report, and just sort of give you an overview of how it's organized, and some specifics on some other very key papers and publications on test security that have come out recently that we think may have be interest to you, or at least we want to make sure you're aware of these different things. Okay, so next slide. We should be seeing a big wave coming along in the ocean. And not that this wave is necessarily the real one hitting Oklahoma right now, but this is our picture of what we're calling the perfect storm in test security that hit states in recent years. So next slide. So around 2011, maybe even in 2010, we're starting to hear a lot of things going on, and certainly Atlanta stuff was starting to pop up. DC public schools, there were issues there. John and/or I were being called in to go visit places, and there was some suspicion of what was that some things that weren't quite right were going on, and a number of other things too. Test security started becoming a big concern at the national level and in some states, and that started growing fast. And so this perfect storm seemed to pop up in 2011-12 and caused a lot of concern. And some of the things that were causing the concern is as states were moving to have teacher accountability systems, and using tests to evaluate teachers, there were higher stakes, which could lead to some unethical behavior. There were the consortia were popping up at that time, PARC and Smarter Balanced, and there was concern about how do you maintain security across a whole lot of states, not just an individual one. Probably the worst thing going on was the press was digging and digging on anything they could find, and if they did find some sort of cheating incident, then they'd blow it up into a great big deal. And admittedly, the Atlanta one was a big deal, but you know, all of a sudden we're seeing all sorts of cheating on test stories on major newspapers, New York Times, USA Today, Washington Post, others, and none of these stories were very good for state assessment business or anybody in the testing business. And so these instances, like I was referring to in large districts, these became more of just rumor. They became reality. And so go ahead to the next slide. So what we were trying to figure out what to do from a TILSA SCAS perspective is, was there something we could do to actually address this and help states? And so John and I proposed maybe coming together and shaping up some sort of resource that states could use that would guide them to be more proactive and improve their test security procedures in their states. And so this project was founded back in early 2012, went on for about a year and a half, and we worked closely with the 21 or so states that are in TILSA, got input from them, lots of examples, met with them. Every time they had a meeting, we'd have a work group meeting. And basically all of our work in interacting with them and feedback we got from states was resulted in the Test Security Guidebook that was issued in June 2013. And already we knew that it was getting a lot of attention, and states and TILSA got it, and CCSSO made it available to all states. And by the way, it's actually on Amazon too for a very minor purchase. That wasn't our thinking, that was CCSSO, but it was interesting they did that. So anyway, we're talking to states, and we thought, wow, so mid-2013, here's this new resource, what's going on? And over the course of the following months, John and I were hearing a lot of things. One was, yes, test security continues to be important to states and districts, that states, especially our TILSA states, were saying, well, this was good information and guidance in the guidebook, but we need more information. There's still a long ways to go. And states were already utilizing the information that was in the guidebook to make some plans, and you know, some states were very proactive and others were still trying to figure out what was going on. we were also aware that the U.S. Department of Education was looking at the guidebook and looking at test security issues too. So all these things, I mean, the topic did not go away just because the guidebook came out. It just got more attention, actually. So next slide. We did a lot of presentations on the guidebook too at the National Conference on Student Assessment, at AERA NCME. I forget where else now, but it was getting a lot of publicity and again, well received out in the field in the state assessment community and others too. We were hoping also that it was changing possible practice by testing vendors. But anyway, so in a subsequent TILSA meeting, and we're talking with the Test Security Workgroup, they said, we got to keep going on this. We need more. And we thought, well, what would help them? And we came up with the idea of writing a lessons learned report. What we learned from the time the guidebook came out and states were implementing new policies. And plus, there was just a lot of things going on test security all across the country at all sorts of levels of government and elsewhere. And so we just said, let's just keep this momentum going and come up with another report. And we thought the lessons learned would be a good a way of catching all the different information. So next slide. So this is our interactive time. We have a question for you, Sonia, and everybody at Oklahoma Department of Ed. Do you have copies of the guidebook? The two of them?
I believe I have a copy of the lessons learned report. I don't believe I have a copy of the actual guidebook, the initial one.
Okay, I know I've sent you links at some point or another. I'm not sure if I sent you the link to both of those, Sonia. I think I know I sent you lessons learned not too long ago when it came out because it was hot off the press.
Right.
Your predecessor may have actually gotten a copy of the guidebook since it came out a couple years ago.
If that's floating around here, I don't know where it is.
Would it help if you had a hard copy of each?
That would be great.
Okay, and then, I mean, we can probably do that, but we also want to make sure you and everybody on your team has the electronic versions too. So we'll follow up with that, and you may have to print out some electronic copies or just make sure that the right people have the links.
Okay, I'll do that.
So, and I'll get to this later, but we're thinking these reports are increasingly important because now that what peer review has come out with its test security guidance and there's more focus on things, having these reports as resources may be good to cite as evidence or at least refer to as you're making changes in your assessment program. All right. Actually, what you told me, Sonia, doesn't surprise me. It's besides that's why we're doing this webinar. Is we're not sure what states have gotten into their hands. TILSA people, because they worked on it, they have it, but TILSA is still not all the states. It's not even half of them. So as we're talking with them, we're trying to highlight things. All right, let's move on to the next slide. I'll finish up my talk here. So the lessons learned report, the new one, was modeled on the guidebook, and this was an idea that John and I had with some input from the U.S. Department of Education and certainly a lot of talking with the states in the TILSA group. We wanted to have an introductory chapter to kind of lay out the importance of security. We wanted to have a chapter on what currently exists with different reports and publications and formal documents, whatever, on test security. And And then we wanted to have chapters on prevention, detection, and investigations, and highlight things that are, by providing guidance, highlight things, or highlight lessons that have been learned in states, which is what we did in that report. So next slide. So like I said, I will tell you some of the things that are in this lessons learned report, and then John will do the rest. So we noticed that as we were putting together lessons learned report in 2014 and early 2015, there was a lot of things that had been going on just in a couple years. And I wanted to make sure that all these things got captured and summarized so that somebody could actually see, what are these documents and are they important? So the first one on this list here, the Guidebook, which is the predecessor from TILSA. The next one is an NCME white paper on testing and data integrity. This came out when all the heat was on and a lot of things were going on. So it's an important paper. I'll tell you more a little bit later in this webinar. Then what came out also last year, the long-awaited joint standards from APA, AERA, and NCME, and it addressed test security quite a bit more than in previous editions. So we wanted to highlight that, of course, since that's important to everybody in the testing and measurement community on standards for best practice. Okay, next slide. Speaking of best practice, there's a report that has, this is the second edition of it now, the Operational Best Practices for Statewide Large-Scale Assessment Programs, comes from ATP and CCSSO. So a revised second version of it came out in 2013. We weren't able to describe it in our first report on the guidebook, but it's got all sorts of information too, and I'll highlight some of that in a couple more slides. The Handbook of Test Security came out in 2013 also, and John Fremer is a co-author on that, or co-editor. NCEO, the group up at University of Minnesota that looks at students with disabilities issues, they issued a paper last year about test security and assessing kids, special ed kids. So that was an area that had been neglected a little bit, and we wanted to make sure it was highlighted. And it is, we did provide information in our lessons learned report on that too. ACT, on their own, issued a paper on state policies and laws. And then there were a whole bunch of other things that came out during this time too, which you may have seen because they got a lot of attention. The Government Accountability Office looked at states' security procedures. Office of Inspector General issued this big paper. Most of these governmental things from the federal government were somewhat critical of what was going on, and saying that test integrity needed to be improved. And the Feds also held a test integrity summit in Washington, D.C. during this time period. So we also addressed that too and put information in our reports. So anyway, it was just a lot of things going on. And when I look at this list, it's a moving target, meaning that we had to summarize it up to a certain point so we could publish this report. And now since then, since earlier this year, there's been other key documents of which I referred to, like the peer review guidance, which we knew was going to have something on test security in it, and indeed it does. So we can talk about that more later too at the end of our webinar. So next slide. So I wanted to highlight 2 or 3 of what I think are really key documents that if you haven't looked at, you probably should. One is this Operational Best Practices report, and like I said, this is version 2 of it, so it's been updated with more information on online assessment, since so many states have moved to computer-based testing, and more emphasis on test security in states, since that topic has become so so hot. And so David Foster, who's the president of Caveon, actually wrote one of the chapters on best practices for achieving test security, and it's pretty much a nuts to bolts type of chapter. Talks about everything from the design and development of assessments and gives recommendations on things to do, all the way through analysis and reporting and use of results and test security. So it's very, it's really the kind of content that's good for an operational person to refer to, and anybody that's leading up an assessment program. So lots of good examples in there based on what, well, basically what testing vendors and others are doing to maintain security. And it's got that Caveon insight on it too, since Caveon's been working in this area for 12 plus years now. So that's one report. It's very good. I believe you can get it from the CCSSO website. I'm sure if you just Google it, you'd find it. And if your state doesn't have it, I recommend that you have at least one copy of it around, a hard copy that people can look at. Okay, next. So I mentioned earlier in my talk that the joint standards came out last year, and this was long, long awaited. Their process, it took 15 years for them to revise these educational psychological testing standards, but they came out and they addressed a lot of new things. Again, online assessment was one, but test security had become a big one. So they have a lot of standards related to test security, not necessarily from a state perspective, just from the industry's perspective on what is appropriate to do. And basically, a lot of their guidance in the joint standards is on integrity and reliability, validity, and fairness of test results. And so they identify a lot of ways that test scores can become invalidated, and it's through improper administration or something going on that makes you suspicious of the accuracy and fairness of those test scores. So this is another document that is highly recommended that people in the testing business take a look at, and it covers, I mean, the standards cover pretty much everything related to testing, and then the test security part is involved in a lot of different areas, especially in test administration. Okay, one more slide, please. And then one other document, if you haven't seen it, it's short. It's only maybe 9-10 pages long, if even that, is the one that NCME put out. And it's been quoted many, many times, and at a lot of presentations I've been at on test security, I see it come up a lot. But the key thing there is that it emphasizes, in particular, state assessment programs, that if you want to have valid testing, you need to ensure that there are no security breaches or anything done that would invalidate scores. So it takes that kind of perspective in there, but it's, again, it looks at the critical things on how do you maintain a valid, fair test. It also addressed things that don't impact you now in Oklahoma, since you're not in the consortium, but there's a lot of things about what might happen in a consortium if there was a breach, the dangers of having really, really wide testing windows, just a lot of different things. And the big recommendation from this white paper on testing integrity is just that states need to have more comprehensive policies and procedures implemented for their assessment program to protect it and to ensure that your test results are indeed valid. All right, so I think that's it for my talk. Next slide, we have another question. and some discussion opportunity time. So one of the things we'd like to talk with you about is you've seen this list of resources, and you may be aware of other things too. What have you found useful?
Hi, John. It's Craig. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Craig. Hi.
Oh, I didn't even know my computer had a microphone, actually. So I do have a question. Can you go into some detail on DOM-C, discrete option multiple choice, and how that could improve test security and how it is, I guess, viewed more favorably from a psychometric standpoint?
Okay, I couldn't hear everything you said, Craig, but it was something about the discrete option multiple choice items and how that could help.
Yes.
All right, I'd be glad to, but I would defer first to John if you want to step in on this one. If you're not muted.
I guess getting unmuted would be a good first step. Thank you. So the discrete option multiple choice item type essentially uses the charm of computer delivery by delivering the choices for each question one at a time. So you're a test taker, there's a question posed, you're presented with option A. If you think that's right, you say it is, and then you're finished. And you go into question 2. If you don't think that question 1, the answer A is right, look at answer B, answer C until you find one that you think is correct. Its benefit is in limiting the amount of exposure that the full content of a question gets. So on average, across use of that type of item, the alternatives only get about half as much exposure as they would otherwise. It's still relatively early on for the item type. Our president of Caveon Test Security, Dave Foster, is the inventor of it, so he's a passionate advocate, and he's worked quite a bit with others. Neil Kingston is one of the people he's collaborated with to try it out. And as with anything new, the first thing you want to know is, well, does it work? You know, how does it compare to other types of items? What do people think of it? And it stands up well in terms of classifying people who have been given more than one type of test. People don't care for it much. They have to be exposed to it and form an opinion. Well, I can see its benefits. They like the one at a time quite a bit, but the idea of not being able to choose the best or the least, that seems to bother them some. Does that get you started, Craig?
Yeah, and that was actually going to be my next kind of follow-up question was, you know, how do you have, when they're developing the assessment, do they have to kind of pull out that whole best or least type of, you know, pieces of in questions? I know you want the best answer, but if you don't see all the choices, then how would you know? You know, so that would be interesting to know how they deal with that.
Yeah, the folks that work in it, and I've spent a lot of years as a test developer, but not in recent years. I would think you would need to get familiar with it, the item type, and then decide whether you could test everything you wanted in that format. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were some types of items that wouldn't be best in that format. So I think if I were planning a new test, I would think I could do a lot of it that way, but I probably would want to reserve some that I could still do the best, most, compare and contrast type. But I'd be glad to follow up, Craig, and get you more information on DOM-C.
Okay, yeah. I think it's very intriguing. What about, have any tests integrated it into their item types?
It is the way of testing within the Certified Exam Security Professional. So the entire test is DOMC. So that's one of the largest kind of operational uses of the exam type. And we're learning quite a bit just from that application.
Craig, this is John Olson again, too. In our reports, both the guidebook, lessons learned, we try to address different things and bringing ideas and processes that are being used, like in licensure certification, and make states aware of them. So if you're looking at different things, and especially item types, and which would typically be things we'd either put in a report or we'd make a recommendation that the state ought to think about going down that path. For example, if we did a security audit or something for Oklahoma, there's other things you might want to consider too, like the old basic way of getting your items a little more secure. Just mix up the options so that one kid gets item 10, and the options are A, B, C, D, multiple choice, but then a kid sitting next to them gets the same item stem, but the options are mixed up. So, you know, A might be B and B might be C and whatever. And that's to defeat people who are memorizing score keys, doing that type of stuff. So mixing up options, or even mixing up the placement of items so that two kids sitting side by side aren't exactly seeing the same item on the same page. That's another recommendation. And then there's also cloned items, if you're aware of those, which we sometimes recommend also that states or others consider. So there's a lot of different things out there that can improve security. Especially, you know, we keep looking at paper and pencil tests, but as states moving more and more to online stuff, got all these computer screens up and stuff, and we noticed that kids like to look at each other's computer screens. You know, taking some security steps on how those items appear is sometimes a good thing. So again, like John, we'd be glad to share more information with you if you want.
What about the psychometric ramifications of doing those type of changes to items?
Well, we tend to be cautious by nature, so and both of us have research in our background, so we always think more research is needed. Do pilots before you introduce anything new, and then only after you've reassured yourself that you can achieve the same level of quality, however you define quality, reliability, correlation with other measures, then and only then introduce the changes. But in some ways, this is a great time for change. There's a receptivity to doing things different and an impatience with the way we've done it before. I mean, that may not me feel good that we keep getting people say, well, you ought to have a better way of doing it. But coming back and saying, yeah, well, we think we have a better way. This is what we like to try. If only they would give us a little bit more time to do the work, I think we could show them some good stuff.
Like John said, psychometricians can be very conservative. And so, I mean, there's some things you can do and some things you can't do, or you're not going to get buy-in from psychometricians. And one of those is you're equating items, the core set you have, equating from year to year. You can't really change those. Psychometricians really want them to be exactly the same, look the same, be in the same place on the test. But you can certainly mix up other things and between options or item placement. I mean, that's one of the advantages people talk about adaptive tests, is that different items are going to different, and so that in itself does increase security. But you know, there's still things you need to keep on there. There's been, John mentioned about the research on, there's been a lot of research some of these things like cloned items. It definitely has gotten a lot of research over the years.
Hey, John, this is Rochelle. Just one more quick question in the question box. Amy's wondering if the DOMC experience makes the test-taking experience considerably longer. And then just a time check, we have about 20 minutes left.
Okay. No, it does not make it longer. It actually makes it somewhat shorter. so that's a good thing. So we want to stop at the end of the hour. Is that our target, Rochelle?
Yes.
Oh, I thought this was a 90-minute webinar. It's not today?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was not sure. Tristan, is it 90 minutes or 60 today? 60.
You have a hard, fast shutdown at 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock your time, Sonia?
Yes.
Okay, then we better get moving, John.
Okay. So the next section, if we go to the next slide. I'm going to touch on the three main areas. It's kind of a structuring element for our work: prevention, detection, and follow-up investigations, and then have some summary recommendations. So let's turn first to prevention. And these are our summary from experiences cutting across a number of projects. By designing for test security, not trying to kind of bolt on after you do everything else how we're going to provide for security, but have security in mind at every stage along the way. What kind of items are used? How are they presented? How do we handle the scoring, reporting, and so on? Second is more attention to how we monitor what goes on in the testing room. We put a lot of work into that in state assessment, training every year for district test coordinators, manuals, reports, and so on. But we're we're confirming that that's where the trouble happens during the time of test administration, and putting more attention into who's watching, how are they watching, what are they looking for. Key prevention practice. Considerable more sophisticated use of data forensics analyses. In the paper and pencil world, it took a while, but eventually erasure analysis, which had been a kind of a casual, sometimes done thing, became quite widely used. In a way, those of us who spend our lives in test security, it's not and never was the best method of data forensics, but it's something that you can do. If there's a major problem like Atlanta, it really turns it up. But it's not the best method, and now as we moved into computer delivery, there's not a lot of evidence yet that answer changing, which we can detect in computer delivery, has the same level of importance that erasures did in paper and pencil, in part because the erasures often occurred after testing, whereas the answer changes usually have to be done during testing, so it's a different factor that causes the problems. By training material for schools, I do mean for schools, not just for districts. So we've done a very good job in state assessment in trying to develop materials for training district test coordinators to go on and train schools. But we haven't always paid attention to what exactly did we expect those district test coordinators to use when they went to the schools. And we see more attention being given to that. Here's how we're going to train you, but we're not just going to say and then go on and train. We're saying here's materials based on what you've already learned that you can use in the school setting. And the last is just the way we tend to be in testing. We want to get better each year. We look at what we did the previous year and we try to do better the next year. Okay, next slide. Moving on from prevention to detection. So what's happening? Not just increased use of data forensics, significantly increased use, psychometric statistical methods, but expansion of what's used. In our Caveon data forensics, we run a dozen different indicators, and that tends to be the pattern now. Do it multiple ways and look for the different kinds of evidence that tend to go with the different types of misbehavior. A clear focus on what we're about is fairness, for individual students and classes and schools, and validity of results. We're not doing detection so we can catch the relatively rare improperly behaving teacher. That is an outcome of it, but we're really doing it in order so that we have fair and valid results. And that's a better flag to be carrying as you march into this battle. We're seeing increased professional association attention, both at the NCME that John Olson had mentioned. We have a whole conference in its 4th year now, the Conference on Test Security. It's showing up in other places. The industry group Association of Test Publishers, it's probably 3 times as present in programs as it was just 4 or 5 years ago. And research programs at not just at vendors and states themselves, but in universities. Dissertations are coming out about research on test security and publications of the type that John has mentioned. We're developing some neat tools. I think in the interest of time, I won't try to cover them in detail, but if you've never heard about Trojan horse items, those are items that are included in a pool such that if that pool is stolen, which happens very often in certification testing, they steal the pool and the key, but the key they steal is wrong. And there's a set of items, maybe as few as 8, that are stolen with the wrong key. So if you don't really know the content, and all you do is go by these items you stole and the key that went with it, you're going to get a good score on those 8 items, but nobody else is, because they're not going to answer the wrong key. They're going to answer the right answer. So it's very clever. I haven't seen it used yet in state assessment, but conceptually it could be used. Next slide on detection. So what in general have we been learning in our efforts to detect improprieties in all types of assessment? One is to be very conservative. Don't just investigate everything that's statistically significant. That's a bad strategy. Go after the worst of the worst. You can't afford to lose a case if you're going to try to take action against someone's license or take some other type of cancellation of scores. Go after the worst of the worst and be very public about what you did. And how will you be public? In the way that your communication program that you worked out in advance with all levels of management of your program and communication helped. Make sure you've thought through, if you're going to use data forensics, exactly how you will use those results before you do any analyses. This is one of the things that Greg Cizik has said. You're thinking of doing a study, more data forensics to see if you have cheating on your state assessment, save your money. You do have cheating on state assessment, but make sure you figured out how to use the results. This is a lot of information in state assessment. People get very nervous about the idea of taking action on the basis of results. And they have this position, oh, we certainly can't act on data alone. We need witnesses and confessions and so on. Well, most of the people who are arrested and sent to prison for crimes wouldn't be there if they weren't acting on data. And very carefully planned and constructed data forensics can produce results that are plenty good enough to take action. And the last, which is like preaching to the converted, having been through computer delivery to the extent that a state has, they know that they have to take into account that the delivery method influences the strategies one can apply. I want to mention a couple of several good detection practices. So the next slide. If you're planning on making more use of data forensics in Oklahoma and taking more definitive action, look up what they've done in Florida, where they use a very extensive communication program to make sure everybody at the district level and the community, the legislature, the government's office know what you're doing and why. Because you're going to get all kinds of questions once you start doing extended work, and you might as well learn from them. Another place I suggest looking is in Mississippi, where they've expanded their regulations and even put in legislation to make cheating on tests by adults a crime, which it hadn't been before. And the last one of those practices I want to mention is using data forensics analyses before scores are reported. It's a lot easier to hold scores because you want to look at them more carefully than it is to withdraw scores or take action if those scores have already gone out to schools and decisions made. Next slide. This kind of syncs with the previous one, regular use of data forensics and using them in the scoring and reporting cycle. But I want to make the last point that's on this slide, using at least 4 different methods. The single best method, if you can only use one, and you don't have to use only one, you can use several, is the similarity of responses student to student. And the Caveon data forensics method is to build a model of what constitutes normal student behavior and then look to see how many instances of abnormal behavior show up in every classroom. Aberrance is simply not following the model that you would expect across a lot of students. Why would you get the hard questions right and the easy questions wrong? Well, not often. Maybe special case, homeschooling, whatever, but not multiples in the same class unless something was going on that shouldn't have been going on, like someone helping the students in the course of the exam, maybe helping them on the hard, not on the easy, thinking they could do the easy ones. Gain scores. I always think one ought to do gain scores both because they can be very revealing and because the media can do them. They don't need any special statistical help to look at gain scores, and so many of them have been doing that. And finally, for paper and pencil for sure, erasures and answer changes in computer-delivered exams. Follow-up investigations. The fact of our life is that there have been a bunch of highly publicized investigations, and the media has learned that you can keep on running the data and studies and reports over and over. I live near New York City, so the impersonation cases in Long Island for the SAT and the ACT assessment got a great deal of attention. Atlanta public schools problem got attention all over the country. There's also more clear evidence of schools and states and certifying agencies being willing to give major weight to data, to turn outside their school or state, to use external investigators, and to combine expertise of different types. Next slide. Before you plunge into any large-scale investigations, you want to develop clear investigative plans. Who's going to do what is going to be the basis for action, who has the responsibility. And if you really dig into it, I think you're going to conclude, if you read up on it and listen to the experts, that a standard practice that we've been following in the states of going to districts first is not a good practice. It's standard, but it's not good. It's okay to do that if there's not clear evidence from the data that there's a big problem and it's in that district. It doesn't make any sense to ask the district to make the first investigation when the evidence you have in advance is that it's not localized in a class or a school, but it cuts across classes and maybe schools. Then you want to turn to the state itself or outside help to carry out those investigations. And then we've kind of learned a number of things that are summarized in our report of how to manage an investigation. I'll just mention one example. Don't go to the person that you're most nervous about who might have misbehaved. Ask them questions last. Ask everybody else first. And then and only then, when you have a lot of the background, go and talk to the folks who may have been most responsible for problems. I think what I want to do now, Tristan, is skip the next 2 slides. They'll get to our colleagues in Oklahoma, when we send these out, and just go to the question and answer. I don't want to leave our Oklahoma guests without having a chance to ask questions at the very end. So let's go there. So go to the Q&A slide. Question, anyone? For me or for John Olson? Very quiet.
How about if I ask a question to maybe get things going?
Go for it.
Of the things you've seen in the peer review guidance that you'll have to provide evidence to U.S. Department of Ed on related to test security for your state assessment program, what are the things that you're wondering about the most?
Well, Special Ed is going to have to submit a lot of that information for this year because of the changes in their tests, and our office won't so much have to deal with it just yet. I mean, we're going to evaluate it, but that's kind of been on the back burner for now.
One of the things that's in there is the state must have evidence that it has a test security manual, sort of standalone document that summarizes all the state's policies, procedures, and things related to security. It seems pretty straightforward, but our experience working with states is most states don't really have that thing. Is that going to be?
So I guess the question then would be, are they looking for granular specific tasks, or are they looking at bigger picture guidance and requirements by the state?
That's a good question. I don't know what they're going to be looking at. This is all kind of new stuff.
Because if it's more a bigger picture type thing, then we're good. I mean, our test prep manual is very specific, and it calls things out. Now, if they're wanting like nitty-gritty details, that might be a different story. But I'm looking through our test prep manual, and I mean, we've got a lot of it addressed in this test prep manual. That, and it may not say test security, but it's the reason why we're doing it is for test security purposes. So I think we might have something to work with, and certainly I wouldn't imagine that they would say that you have to have a separate manual from your other manuals, because in my opinion, the test prep manual, I mean, we could say, well, it encompasses all of that. So why would we want another separate manual? We already have, several other manuals. We don't need another one, floating around. So, I mean, I guess it depends on what happens in peer review and how favorably that's viewed. Maybe we can take our test prep manual, mark it up, and say, well, here it addresses it here, here, and here, and here's evidence of it, and we're good. But yeah, I think we need to actually take a look at what we have first, and then determine if we need an additional manual.
Well, we've come to our hour. Any other questions before we wrap? Rochelle, do you want to do a what's next?
Sure, John. Can you go forward on the slide, Tristan? Thank you. So thanks today for your time today and joining us, and we appreciate the good questions. If you have any more questions, feel free to send them. I've included both John's emails on the final slide there. You can get those there. Many of you probably also have my email or Tristan's email from the invite, so feel free to reach out that way. We have recorded this session, and we will provide you with a copy of the recording and the slides from the session, and also a link to that Lessons Learned guidebook that we've been talking about. So thanks again, everyone, for your time. Appreciate you and hope that you have a great week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care, folks.
Thank you.